lots of photos feel a little bit flat or are a little bit uninteresting because you can't clearly make out what the subject is. In your mind, you know what you're trying to photograph, but the person looking at the picture doesn't quite understand what it is you're trying to draw attention to. This is often because the main subjects of your photo blends into the background. You can't clearly see what the subject is when you're looking at the photo. So what we need to do as photographers is make sure our subject stands out from the background. And there are a few ways to do that. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 ways you can make your subject stand out from the background. They are by blurring the background with a shallow depth of field, by using contrast or color to make your subject stand out from the background, or by using light to make sure that your subject is lit differently from the background. Using one of these three ways, or more than one of these 3 ways, will ensure that your subject is clear to the viewer and make your subject stand out from the background and be clearly the subject of your photo. So first, let's talk about depth of field. This is a very common technique that photographers use for separating their subject from the background. Basically, it means your subject is in focus and the background and even the foreground is out of focus, and this makes your subject look separate from it. If you take a photo with your subject in focus and a background also in focus, it's difficult to know what it is that we should be looking at. So by blurring the background, we ensure that the subject stands out from the background and stands out in the photo. This works particularly well if your subject is against a very busy kind of background with lots of different things going on, and you don't want to draw attention to that. You want to only draw attention to your subject. The way to do that, or one way to do that, is by blurring that background so that all of that information doesn't come through in the photo. It goes to a nice soft kind of mush, which is not distracting, and all of the attention is brought onto the subject of your photo. So how do we blur the background in the photo? We need to do a few things with our camera. If we're using a traditional camera with a lens and a body, we want to set the aperture to be a large aperture. You can use aperture priority mode or AV mode in your camera, or you can do this in manual mode if you're comfortable doing that. You want to use a large aperture. The largest aperture available will give the shallowest depth of field with the most blur. So you want to choose f1.8, f2.8, f4, f5.6, whatever is the largest aperture on your camera, you want to use that. Then we want to use a lens which has got a bit of a zoom to it. So if you've got a lens which zooms in and out, you want to zoom in as much as possible. So that may be the 55 end of a kit lens or the 70 end of a 24-70 lens, for example. You want to use a longer end of that lens to maximize the shallow depth of field. And then we want to get relatively close to the subject compared to the background. So if you're photographing a flower or a person, we want to be relatively close to that subject. And then we want the background to be relatively far away to give the camera a chance to throw that thing out of focus. It won't work if the person is standing right next to a wall, because the wall and the person are the same distance from the camera or very similar distances from the camera. We need a good ratio of distance between the subject and what it is you're putting behind it. So that can mean you can be very close to the subject with the background a few meters away, but if you're only 20 centimeters away from the subject, that will throw the background out of focus nicely. Or if you've got a bigger scene, you can be a bit further away, but if the mountains are miles away, they'll be thrown out of focus. So large aperture, long end of your zoom lens, and relatively close to your subject compared to the background. To make it work with a phone, which replicates a similar effect, again, you need to be relatively close to the subject with a background far away to make it work its best. A phone will do it kind of computationally, but it's replicating that shallow depth of field effect you get with a camera and a lens. So you can, with your phone, also blur the background, make the subject stand out. Use portrait mode, it's often called. Get close to your subject, background is a bit far away, and blur the background to make your subject stand out more from that background. The next way we can make our subject stand out from the background is using contrasting colors or tones. So if our subject is a different color or tone to the background, it will stand out. So this means if you're photographing a person in a red coat, if you take a photograph of them against the orangey or reddish toned wall or background, they won't stand out so much. But if you take that photo of that person in a red coat against a black background or even a green background, one that's very contrasty in terms of color, the subject will stand out. You can do this with tones as well. For example, with a dark colored object or thing against the more light colored background. Or you can even use just one area of the photo to separate your subject from the background. For example, a door within a wall, but then your subject is walking past that door. That just lets the subjects have a little bit of contrast behind them, a bit of a frame behind them that makes them stand out. So the second way to make things stand out from background is through a little bit of contrast. That could be tones or color or a simplicity behind that contrasts with the subject that you're shooting. You don't have to blur the background in this instance, but because the subject is contrasting against the background for various reasons, you can make the subject stand out from the background by having them with a bright color against a dark background, for example, will work really well to separate your subject from the background and make it clear what the subject of your photo is, or at least make the subjects of your photo stand out more than if they blend into the background. And finally, light. Light is a really nice way to separate your subject from the background. This means having your subject of your photo lit differently from the background. So there are two ways you can do this. You can have your subject brightly lit against a dark background, or you can make a silhouette where the background is very bright, but the subject is not very well lit, so it forms a shape against a bright background. So ways to do this: look for places where there is a person walking out of a tunnel, for example, into the light, but the background is very dark, and then as the subject hits the light, they are really bright, but with a black or dark background behind them because there's no light behind them, the subject really stands out. Or place yourself in a situation where people are walking past in shadows, but behind them is very brightly lit. For example, people walking through the shadows with the sky behind them. If you correctly expose that shot, you will get nice silhouettes, and those subjects will be standing out, and it'll be clear what the subject is because they are much more differently lit to the background. So there's two ways you can use light. One is to have your subject really brightly lit against a dark background, and the other way is to have your subject in shadows against a brightly lit background to have a silhouette. So in this instance, you're basically creating contrast with light itself. You're using the available light to make the subject stand out from the background by having it lit in a very different way that makes it stand out from the background and makes it clear what the subject is. And using these techniques, you'll see actually how much control you have of how much your subject stands out from the background, how much clearer you can make it about what is the subject of your photo. Often they're just subtle changes you need to make about your position, or a little bit more thought needs to go into it, but you can use any of these techniques to make your subject clear and separated from the background and make it clear to your viewer what your photo is about.